Freaks is one of the strangest movies ever made by an American studio.
What I see in the movie Freaks was probably one of the most authentic portrayals of a sideshow.
Freaks is a look into the lives of these sideshow performers. It's basically a soap opera set in a sideshow.
Freaks is not a documentary. It is a Hollywood film, and it is painted in very broad strokes. And yet, it still does show the human side of that which, at first glance, is very inhuman. That is the sideshow, the circus, the carnival sideshow freaks.
When I was a kid, I wasn't crazy about it because it put us in a bad light.
It's an undiscovered masterpiece.
Freaks was produced by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer in the late part of 1931, and it was an attempt to capitalize on the big success other studios were having with horror films, like Dracula and Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This was a brand new kind of Hollywood entertainment. There had been frightening characters in the silent days, but no supernatural monsters, and certainly no real physical anomalies appearing on screen.
I think the great thing about the movie Freaks is the approach that Tod Browning took. What people might not know is that Tod Browning had a background. Early in his career, he worked in sideshows and on carnivals and circuses and things like that.
Tod Browning had done many pictures with Lon Chaney Sr., the Man of a Thousand Faces, and they specialized in films about physical deformity and mutilation. They had worked together on one of MGM's biggest hits of the 1920s. It was called The Unholy Three, and it was based on a novel by Todd Robbins, and it had a very outlandish premise. It was about three criminals, kind of a strongman giant, and a ventriloquist, and a midget, who was really quite a nasty little thug, masqueraded himself as a baby. He was originally going to direct The Hunchback of Notre Dame at Universal with Lon Chaney, but was dumped from it after his problems became too much to handle. Irving Thalberg, before he came to MGM, was at Universal, and he had spearheaded that picture. And he seemed to have a special interest himself in these themes about physical abnormality and disability. He was kind of a frail, almost sickly man himself. So it was really a three-way fascination. Chaney was fascinated with these kinds of characters, Browning loved the material, and Thalberg also seemed to take a personal interest. So they created some of the strangest movies ever to come out of Hollywood. Harry Earls, who played the midget in The Unholy Three, came to Browning apparently with a copy of a short story that Todd Robbins, who had done The Unholy Three, had written. It was called Spurs.
And it was it's a much darker story than the movie Freaks actually is. No one comes out of it cleanly because the dwarf comes off very dark, very egotistical, mad at the world. The performer and her lover, who happens to be a bareback rider, not a strong man, in the story, it's a bareback rider, come off as scheming and thinking that the dwarf will be an easy mark, someone that they can get his money and then run off together and have a wonderful life. And the other sideshow freaks in the story come off as very self-centered and not really good people. And no one is clean in that story.
There weren't too many properties, of course, for a performer like Earls, who didn't make his living primarily in movies. So he was keenly interested in this, and it was purchased as a property for Lon Chaney. And it never came about. It may have been a little too much like some of the other pictures Chaney was making. But it was clear that Browning really wanted to push the envelope even further, and with Freaks, for the first time, he got to populate a film with physical spectacles that Lon Chaney never could have approximated in his lifetime. And Chaney became sick and died of lung cancer in 1930. And by that time, Browning had left MGM temporarily. He directed Dracula at Universal and a couple of other pictures. But he came back to MGM, and the studio was eager to capitalize on this brand new genre, the talking horror movie. And the idea, apparently, was to create the most horrifying movie that had ever been done. Tod Browning would now top Dracula with the ultimate horror film. And there's a story that when the screenwriter brought the script to Irving Thalberg and he read it, he kind of dropped his head into his hands and said, "Well, I asked for something horrible, and I guess I got it." Freaks was really Browning's obsession, I think. When he returned to MGM, he was offered the chance to do a big-budget costume drama, the famous detective story, Arsène Lupin, that would have brought the Barrymore brothers together for the first time. And he turned it down. He really wanted to do another circus picture.
I came to the movie Freaks because of my background in magic and sideshow and things like that. And sooner or later, when you get involved in this end of show business, the movie Freaks comes up because it is a very important film.
And I think that's the charm of the film. It more attempted to give you the back of the stage view of what was really going on rather than the audience's conception of what was happening and the grubbiness of a lot of the industry.
He didn't realize his point of view was not what the average man, or certainly the executives at MGM, were thinking when they agreed to this film. And it's just of a time when there was still an adventurous spirit in Hollywood.
A lot of the executives at MGM were not excited about Spurs as a film, especially because they no longer had a performer like Lon Chaney to anchor it. Chaney was one of the biggest bankable superstars of the silent era. But Browning nonetheless wanted to do it. The casting process doesn't seem to have gone really smoothly. Irving Thalberg first wanted Myrna Loy, who was an up-and-coming ingenue who had just been given a contract at MGM to play Cleopatra, a treacherous trapeze artist. And she was absolutely horrified by the script, and in her autobiography she recounted how she had to beg Thalberg to let her out of the part. Myrna Loy's replacement in Freaks was not another up-and-coming ingenue and not a major star, but rather an actress who was nearing the end of her Hollywood career. Olga Baklanova was a former member of the Moscow Art Theater who did a number of distinguished silent pictures. She was only in her early 30s when she made Freaks, which doesn't sound old today, but in those days, actresses started very, very young. Many of the leading ladies of the 1920s were barely out of their teens. She had starred in a celebrated mutilation melodrama of the 1920s, The Man Who Laughs. And no doubt Tod Browning was aware of her appearance in it and what a powerful impact she had in it. She did seem to match the description that Todd Robbins had given of his circus performer in his original short story. He described a tall, blonde, Amazon-like woman. And it may have been just very shrewd casting on Browning's part to pick her because the physical disparity between Olga Baklanova and Harry Earls was all that more pronounced than if a petite actress had played the part. And of course there was this profound sexual tension there. The idea of these two people involved in an intimate way was a little disturbing, I think.
It comes by the finest vineyard of France.
And you sent for it specially for me?
For the most beautiful woman in all the world.
Darling.
It's another way very provocative material could get by the censors, because it's hidden in plain sight. I mean, they can't even see it. And there's nothing in the production code about relationships between normal-sized people and midgets. And virtually at the time the cameras started rolling, it was announced to the press that Jean Harlow would play the part of Venus, the animal trainer. So instead of Jean Harlow, the part of Venus went to Lila Hyams, who was a very respected actress, but she was not a major star.
You're a funny guy, Frozo. Sometimes you panic me.
Don't I know it? I panic the world because I use my noodle.
Wallace Ford was probably a natural for the part of Frozo. I mean, it's a very American part and full of wisecracks. He specialized in this kind of character. He often played wisecracking reporters. The role of Hercules was originally intended for Victor McLaglen, and this, of course, would have reunited him with Harry Earls from The Unholy Three. But McLaglen was replaced by Henry Victor, who was an actor who had quite a bit of stage experience. He was from Germany, and he also worked on the stage in London before coming to Hollywood.
I'm through wasting my time and money on things like you.
Yeah, your time, but my money.
Ungrateful little tramp.
Freaks is not a dirty word. There's nothing wrong with looking at somebody that is different than you are. And I would defend this to my dying breath. If you walked down the street and you saw a person that was 9 feet tall, you would turn and look at that person. And the reason you turn and look at the person is because they're different. They're unusual.
Well, I think the most important thing about working with people with physical abnormalities is that underneath it all, they're human beings. And you have to treat them with as much respect as anyone else. And the thing about it is that people from the very beginning to the modern day, and I'm sure on after we're all gone, people will still be interested in that which is unusual, especially people that are unusual.
Well, it's an old concept. I think if we go far enough back, particularly on the European side, the exhibition of freaks, human oddities, or whatever word we all feel comfortable with, is as old as time immemorial.
Life is too difficult to force someone to perform. People do it of their own free will.
I am a professional working little person actor and have been for 12 years now in stage and film and television, commercials. And I think there's definitely a sense of fascination and voyeurism into, and I feel it with other people of difference. I mean, I can't pretend like I'm above being compelled to watch people who are completely different than me.
The essence of all show business, whether it be a famous singer who can hit incredibly high notes, or a beautiful actress who's known for her sexy body, or a person who's 3 feet tall, or someone who's 8 feet tall, or someone who has no limbs or too many limbs. It's all exploitation. There's only one show business, and it's all about selling to the public that which makes you different.
I think exploitation is when I think you have to be very careful to limit it to the individual. And when the individual feels like they are being used and feels uncomfortable about doing what they're doing, then it's exploitive. I think that society has to be very careful about deciding for others what is harmful to the individual.
Little people should always work because they have to have something to do like everybody else, because it fills up their mind and they get up with a purpose. You know, I have to do this, I have to do that. But it's, they serve their purpose in motion pictures, I'll tell you that, because between the stand-in and the photo double and the stunt work, why, it's quite a bit of work if you're capable of doing what they want.
There were some people that took advantage of people that were physically different, but that happens all over show business, and I think in every industry. So the interesting thing was that they often made a good living, and it was a decent life.
Number one, they found a way to make a living that they probably thought they would never be able to do because of their deformity. Number two, they were placed in an environment of acceptance from other people that had other physical problems, and they could hold their head up, they could wind up buying a house and all the things that everybody wanted in the, quote, normal people. So it was a great equalizer.
Browning, of course, was very familiar with sideshows and sideshow headliners and sideshow attractions, and it didn't take long for hundreds of resumes and photographs to be submitted from circuses and sideshows from all over the world.
They had to have assembled more bona fide human oddities and very, very highly respected sideshow acts from that era than anything that's ever happened since.
It was a pretty gutsy thing that Tod Browning made two of the leads of the movie, these little people, Harry and Daisy Earl.
They weren't relegated to bit players. They did lines, and they were very significant to the storyline. Browning's confidence in them must have been quite unique at that point where he was putting his career on the line, which we all know that he did with the film.
She's the most beautiful big woman I have ever seen. Why, hon, how you talk. I should be jealous pretty soon. Don't be silly.
Harry Earl's real name was Kurt Schneider, and he was a member of a family of little people. They came from Germany to the United States around the time of World War I, and while working at Coney Island, they were billed as the Dancing Dolls, and the name stuck, and they very frequently appeared as the Doll Family.
Harry and Daisy, unbeknownst to many people that thought they were husband and wife, were actually brother and sister.
There was Harry, his sister Daisy, Tiny, and Grace. Harry, of course, is probably best known to audiences for his appearance in The Wizard of Oz.
He's one of the representatives of the Lollipop Guild, which is one of the most memorable little scenes of the Munchkin Land there.
He was the gentleman on my left, and I'm the one in the middle. He was a wonderful little man. He was the star of Freaks, and I didn't know that at the time, but as I knew him, I learned all about him, and he was quite a character, because don't forget, he was a little over 40, and I was 17 or 18. So it was interesting to hear about his career.
Of all the doll family, Daisy was the tallest, and she was sometimes billed as the Midget Mae West. The dolls lived together in Hollywood, and to make their lives more comfortable, they furnished their home with child-sized furniture and other custom-made trappings that were appropriate for their size.
One of the people that you kind of look at and then do a kind of a double take, I think, is Peter Robinson, also known as Pete Robinson, who was well known in the circus world as a living skeleton, which was a strange tradition that goes back to the days of the dime museums of the 19th century.
Ah, how's the proud father?
Fine. What was it?
Go. Better luck next time. You might get a couple of Smith brothers.
I'm fine.
Pete Robinson, the human skeleton, followed in the tradition of a lot of human skeletons in circuses, in that he married a fat lady.
He married a woman that was, I think, 462 pounds, Bunny Smith. And just the idea of the living Jack Sprat is, you know, just this wonderful image that people found very entertaining.
And here we have an aspect of sideshows in general that I think is pinpointed better in Freaks than it has been in many other films. It's like communal living.
There was a sense of community and relying upon each other. The Freaks often married each other.
Peter Robinson and many others like him, Percy Pape, happened to be on the Ringling Sideshow when I was there, but presented the same way, usually working in tight-fitting leotards and a top hat.
And from what I understand, he was also really liked. He was a very political man. He had very strong convictions on things, and that's where he would get in these lengthy discussions with anyone who would listen about, politics.
When Browning had done The Unknown, he was content to use one armless wonder, played by Lon Chaney. But for Freaks, he had two, Martha Morris and Frances O'Connor. And they were both born without arms and learned to do all kinds of incredibly dexterous things with their feet.
Frances O'Connor, when she was working in sideshows, would sit there and she would sign the postcards that she had with her feet, and had better penmanship. I can't call it handwriting, but better penmanship than most of the people that were getting the normal people that were buying the cards.
Neither of them is given a lot of time in the film, but it's really amazing to see how they adapted to their disability.
But you got to remember, they'd been doing that since they were born. This was what was natural to them. And it just goes to show that the Freak Act wasn't just about being gawked at, but they often did something. For instance, Frances O'Connor is a good example of that. She was about 70 years old when she passed on, and worked for many, many years in circuses, did a number of different things in her act. She, as I understand, would talk about her condition, and she loved crocheting, so she would crochet with her feet, which I think is an extraordinary image right there. It's just something she enjoyed doing. She would just sit there and crochet. And she also did at one time in a sort of a sharpshooting action, a Wild West kind of thing. And that kind of image of sharpshooting with the feet is just an extraordinary thing to behold.
All of the people that I've worked with over the years have known numerous cast members of Freaks, and she particularly, and their commentary was that she was a very well-adjusted person, loved to have fun, and again did quite well for herself, and had a great attitude about herself. And I think that just to go a step beyond her personal attitude, the viewing public today would find it a little difficult perhaps to believe that these people had a good attitude about themselves, but I can assure you they did.
I bet you thought the tent was on fire, huh? Well, it wasn't. Just the Rollo brothers, panicking them again. But then we do it in every town. We're so used to it, it's getting monotonous.
Going back to the 19th century, people who were born with very small craniums, they're called pinheads in the film. The true term is microcephalic, were presented in circuses and sideshows as kind of missing links.
Oh, I'm sorry, monsieur. I am Madame Petralini. These children are in my circus.
People with mental retardation that were in the sideshow go back to the days of P.T. Barnum. One of the first famous one was a man named William Henry Johnson, who was known as Zip, the What Is It, supposedly because the Prince of Wales visited Barnum and saw this strange person and said, well, what is it? And then he became known as Zip, the What Is It.
Jenny Lee and Elvira Snow had been billed as the last of the Aztec children. And this really goes back to the 19th century when the public was kind of being rocked by the revelations of Darwinian theory.
And the idea of evolution was brought up, and the idea that there could be a missing link, that there could be earlier evolutional elements still in our world, was considered an exotic one, and was something that could be exploited and sold.
of them all, Schlitzie seems to have been the most amiable and actually charmed a lot of the folks on the set.
Schlitzie's real name is Simon Metz. Lived to be about 80 years old and loved being in show business from as far as we could tell, and seemed to really enjoy everything about it.
First time that I ever worked with Schlitzie was working for an operator named Lou Alters, Colonel Lou Alters, and the situation with Schlitzie and many of the pinheads was that they required a personal attendant, a nurse, if you will. Some of them had incontinence problems and so forth. So there was always someone who, quote, took care of Schlitzie. But Schlitzie had a very wry little sense of humor about him. Schlitzie was a man, by the way, who used to appear dressed as a woman in a sort of a house dress or frock.
I think it's interesting in that the act Schlitzie did was a magic act. Schlitzie would show this bag empty, this magic bag, and then have a guy come up and wave his hand over it, and then Schlitzie would reach in and pull out this oversized pair of boxer shorts and point at the guy and giggle. And people would just fall out, just laughing, because Schlitzie was having such a wonderful time performing.
But Schlitzie was quite nice to work with, actually. Very imp or elf-like, that sort of pixie-ish type persona, and it's certainly not hard to understand why that happened, because you're dealing with almost like a precocious child.
And you get that. You so get that in the movie. Just whenever Schlitzie's on the screen, you just cannot take your eyes off of this little sweet person. There are a couple of unforgettable people in the film. Prince Randian certainly is one of those people.
Even more remarkable than the armless women was Prince Randian, who had neither arms or legs, and yet had a long and very successful career as a sideshow attraction. People born without arms or legs were actually rather common in sideshows and circuses, and were variously referred to in their publicity as living torsos, human caterpillars, human worms.
Let me tell you something that everybody around here don't know. We're only killing time with this circus. We've got bigger time to follow, and we can do it too. Well, catch a rack tomorrow night. We got something new.
Now you can do anything with eyebrow?
When you see him do that little bit of his performance, which unfortunately in the film is cut a little bit short, all you see him is with the cigarette in his mouth, and he does the remarkable thing of taking out the match and lighting it and lighting the cigarette. He also rolled that cigarette.
Despite the handicap, in his case it was a total handicap, he was able to perform daily functions.
You would think someone like Prince Randian would have a very limited existence, and yet you look at the statistics that he lived to be 63 years old, and his sort of helper, handler, assistant was his son. Says something right there.
He was married. He had a family. His son was often there to carry him around the sets. And he worked right up to the time of his death. A couple of years after the film, he was performing in a freak show on Times Square, and finished a performance and went back to his dressing room and died. And while we don't know too much about Randian's life, we do know that he was able to, on his own terms, be self-sufficient and gainfully employed. And we may look down our noses at the idea of sideshows, but it's hard to imagine him doing any other kind of productive work. Of all the sideshow performers, the ones we know the most about, because their lives were so well documented, are Daisy and Violet Hilton, the Siamese twins.
The Hilton sisters were probably the best known of the freaks in the film because they went beyond the carnival and the circus sideshow, and they appeared in vaudeville. They were a well-known vaudeville act. They did a number of things, including playing music. Daisy would play the piano, and Violet would play the saxophone.
Mother Nature was very kind to the Hiltons, if kind could possibly be seen as a viable word, because the way they were conjoined allowed them to dance and present themselves in a most entertaining manner, where many of the other unfortunate conjoined twins were joined in such a way that it prohibited much movement.
They were from England originally. They were born in 1908 out of wedlock. Their mother seems to have literally sold them to a couple who immediately put them to work on the carnival circuit. They traveled the world with circuses and carnivals starting at the age of 3. And they were professionally trained to be musicians.
They then became film entities, and sadly their careers coasted practically back into oblivion when they were pitching items in dime stores towards the end of their career. But they were certainly very talented, very attractive.
And while the Hilton sisters put on very happy faces for the public, what the public didn't know is that they were being treated as virtual slaves by their guardians. Guardian, obviously, isn't even the word for it. And they were finally able to legally emancipate themselves. And after 1931, went on to tour vaudeville themselves, and were really rather successful at it. They commanded large salaries and attracted large audiences.
I mean, money by today's standards, that would be considered extraordinary. And this was the 1920s and 1930s. And there's just something just remarkable about them, and brings up all kinds of images of the idea of that Tod Browning plays upon, of one being kissed and the other enjoying it. And things like that, that you just wonder, how connected are they? And what was their experience in life romantically?
There's a subplot in Freaks involving the Hilton sisters and their fiancés and their attempt to get married.
Roscoe, this is Mr. Rogers.
Glad to meet you.
Violet and he are engaged to be married.
Oh, yeah?
Yes, and you must come to see us sometime.
Thanks. You must come to come to see us sometime too.
This really actually reflects something that was going on in their lives. They, largely for publicity reasons, had traveled the country trying to find a state that would issue them a marriage license, and were not able to succeed until 1936. They both were married very briefly, although they were rather sham marriages and kept them in the headlines. But it must have been a heartbreaking thing for them to go through, and of course in Freaks it's treated very, very lightly. There's one anecdote that's been told many times in some different ways about F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was working on some screenplays at MGM at the time, and came into the commissary and encountered the Siamese twins, Daisy and Violet Hilton, and was horrified when he realized that although only one of them was reading the menu, both of them seemed to be understanding it. And he apparently rushed from the commissary, sick to his stomach. We don't know if that really happened or not, but we do know that in one of his short stories called Crazy Sundays, he does make a reference to a studio that's shooting a circus picture with sideshow people.
Johnny Eck was definitely everybody's desire as a leading man. Had a wonderful on-camera persona who's quite handsome, very articulate, And I suspect very strongly that if he had moved on into this era, he probably would have had a wonderful career as a news anchor or something of that sort, and nobody would have ever known that he had any physical abnormality. His very, very strong personality. And also talented beyond all this, as a little tack on, that some people are aware of this. He was a marvelous artist.
The smile on his face, the look of him, if you didn't know there was no lower half of the body, you would not think there was anything unusual about the man.
Did you try that gag I told you about?
Yeah, I did, and it was a wow. Get up here, Johnny, and I'll show it to you. I did everything you told me, and it laid him right in the sawdust. Watch this, Venus. Watch this.
Hello, Venus.
Johnny Eck's real name was Johnny Eckhart. He shortened it for professional purposes and was, of course, world famous for being, the astounding half-boy.
What a lot of people don't know is that Johnny Eck had a twin brother. And very briefly, they worked with a magician who wanted to do the ultimate sawing a man in half illusion. And they did this in vaudeville, in that they were going to, the way it was presented is that they were going to bring out this woman and she's going to be sawn in half, and the guy in the audience said, "Oh, it's just a trick, it's fake. There's no danger whatsoever." And the magician said, "Come on up on stage." And up on stage would walk Johnny Eck's brother. And they'd say, "Look at the cabinet there that she's going to be sawn in half." And they'd look and they'd throw him in. And what they would do is they would then switch the full-size brother for Johnny and a dwarf who was in a costume that was just a pair of pants. And you couldn't see the head of the dwarf, it was just the lower half of the body. They would do the sawing, and the box would fall open, and the pants would go running around, and then Johnny would get up and say, "Hey, where's my lower half going?" He would jump, and they'd run around the stage chasing the pants, and just mayhem would ensue.
Only Johnny Eck, of all the performers, seems to have had a pleasant time making the film, and bits and pieces of his autobiographical writing have been published here and there, and he seems to have hit it off rather well with Tod Browning. He claimed that Browning even wanted to develop a follow-up picture showcasing Johnny, but he was the exception rather than the rule.
The great thing about Hollywood of the late 20s and early 1930s is that the special effects were very primitive, and so they had to use their imagination if they wanted to create something unusual. And Johnny Eck had a cameo in the movie Tarzan Escapes from 1936, in which he plays a Goonie bird, which is this costume that he's wearing, and it's just this strange creature that could only be created with someone who had no lower half of his body.
Captain Frog!